Let me say at the outset of all of this that I am deeply indebted to several authors, to several commentators for their view, for their perspective on this passage. See, Genesis chapter 23 is the sort of text that often just gets overlooked. It's sandwiched between the beautiful, the powerful foreshadowing of chapter 22 and then the narrative advancing story of Isaac and Rebekah in chapter 24. Yet, like all of God's word, it is relevant. It is important for us. It challenges us. So with that, let me ask you a question. Where do you want to be buried? Now, I don't mean that in a morbid way. It's a relevant thought, ultimately, for all of us. For eventually we will physically die, and while our souls will live on, our earthly bodies will have to be accounted for somehow. It's just a fact of life. Now, the follow-up question, and possibly the more important one, is why? See, my thought is that the rationale, the reasoning behind your answer reveals something about you. Where you consider home, what you value, how you want to be remembered, and even what your view of eternity is. Now, it certainly did all of these things for Abraham as he worked through his wife Sarah's death. Here's what I mean. Abraham was a foreigner, a sojourner in the land of Canaan. He had lived there literally for decades, and yet until this point, he didn't actually own any of the land. Certainly God had promised that all of the geography would be his possession, but that promise hadn't actually been realized yet. So when Sarah dies, Abraham mourns for her, but he's also faced with the sort of practical question of what to do with her remains. Should they be taken back to Ur or Haran? Should he borrow a tomb and just temporarily keep her remains there? What the text tells us is that instead, Abraham legally buys a piece of property that includes a crypt. It's his. For the first time, he is putting down firm roots. He is saying, this is where my family will be memorialized. He's saying that this is home. In chapter 25, we see that this is where Abraham too is buried. In chapter 50, we see that Jacob's body is returned from Egypt back to this place. And Joseph even makes his relatives swear that his body would be taken or returned there as well. Here's the point of all of this. This is an exercise of faith. Abraham looked forward by faith and trusted that God would keep his promise and deliver this land into his possession or to his descendants, and that it would be their home just throughout the ages. Abraham lived out his faith in big ways and small ways, in ways that were gritty and real, and in ways that showed his trust in the promises of God. Now, he didn't do this perfectly, of course, but that is the point of this chapter. Faith is seen on mountaintops and in extraordinary moments. But faith is also needed when we face the normal realities of life. The book of Hebrews comments on Abraham, Sarah, and even this event, saying that they had, quote, seen and greeted the inheritance of the land from afar. And that their faith shows that they were desiring a true home, a better country, literally an eternal city. In other words, they were seeking God. And God, of course, is the object of all true faith. This is the lesson of this chapter, I believe, for us. See, we are called, like Abraham, to walk by faith, trusting in the character and the promises of God. Sometimes it means that we, like Abraham, must act without knowing all of the wheres and whens and hows. So let me end in the same way that I began, and that is with the question. What does this look like for you today to live by faith? How do you need to live in light of God's truth and his promises?